This video will give insight into one controversial and still well-known figure, Eli Whitney, as well as a lesser-known figure, Stephen Duncan. The biography we used for Eli Whitney is called The World of Eli Whitney, and it was written by Jeanette Mirsky and Alan Nevins. Jeanette Mirsky was a member of PIN, which was an international organization of writers and a receiver of grants and fellowships from Guggenheim and Rockefeller. Alan Nevins was known for being a journalist, author, and history professor at Columbia University. Our second biography for Stephen Duncan is called An American Planter, Stephen Duncan of Antebellum Natchez in New York, and it was written by Martha Jane Brazy. She was a history professor at the University of South Alabama in Mobile. Eli Whitney is known for inventing the cotton gin, which was a machine that sped the cotton production up by removing the seeds from the cotton. This machine cleaned more than 10 times as much cotton than a man doing such with his hands. This considerably expanded and embraced slave system in the South. Stephen Duncan was the wealthiest slave owner who owned more than 2,000 slaves and isn't mentioned very much in history textbooks. Eli Whitney was born on December 8, 1765 in Worcester, Massachusetts. He was born in a time when the colonists fought for their independence against Great Britain. In the biography, it states, "In the 16 years of Whitney's boyhood and youth, by word and deed, a profound change had been effected. The American colonists won their independence, and peace came. Eli, the oldest of his brothers and sisters, was forced into responsibility with taking care of his siblings, Elizabeth Whitney, Benjamin Whitney, and the youngest, Josiah Whitney. A housekeeper had to look after the children after Eli's mother became sick from the day she gave birth to Josiah till the day of her death. He chased after a college education, in which he was admitted to Yale University when he was 23 years old, and where he graduated as well. The decision that catapulted Eli Whitney into the history books was the invention of the cotton gin. Before the mass production of cotton, indigo, rice, turpentine, tobacco, and corn were produced in the plantations but did not profit well. In the primary source for Eli Whitney, it states, "The green seed cotton alone adapted itself to the variety of conditions imposed by the vast hinterland. Only that crop could lift the South out of its depression, make the capital investment in slaves profitable, and bring rich returns on the world market." Whitney had known this, so he decided to do a study on the plant at an infamous plantation in Georgia at the time, Mulberry Grove. Obtaining a piece of cotton, he examined the boll, the fuzzy fiber part of cotton that surrounds the seeds, and carefully tugged at the fiber to try to separate it from the seeds. In the biography, it states, "He involuntarily happened to be thinking on the subject and struck out a plan of a machine. After around 10 days, he came up with the model of the cotton gin and patented it. However, with this model came a shortcoming, in which the farmers were interested in the machine, so they manipulated the simplicity of the gin's principles. Eli and his partner, Phineas Miller, couldn't create enough gins for the demand, so farmers started making it for themselves. In retaliation, he protested the patent infringement committed by these farmers and found himself caught up in multiple lawsuits. Another setback he experienced was when the factory that Whitney used to manufacture the cotton gins went into flames. He described it in a letter to his father. "How is the scene changed? I found my property all in ashes, my shop, all my tools, material, and work equal to 20 finished cotton machines all gone." Also, in the letter to his father, he described the events of what happened. It caught fire when the workmen were gone to breakfast. The shop was swept clean as any dwelling house the evening before. From the account I have collected since my return, I am convinced that it was not more than 10 or 15 minutes at most after the workmen had left the shop before they returned and found the shop so completely on fire that it was impossible to save the least article of it. There is no known cause of the fire. On top of it, Whitney was suffering from an illness that was malaria at the time. However, these intense setbacks didn't discourage him. He states in the letter to his father, "I do not, however, despair and hope I shall not sink under my misfortune. I shall re-establish the business as soon as possible, but it must be a long time before I can repair my loss."
Antebellum South, agriculture was the main exporter and main moneymaker. One of the highly exported plants was king cotton. Cotton was hard to process and harvest and wouldn't have flourished so much if not for the advancements in machinery such as the cotton gin. Stephen Duncan in the future would be a beneficiary to these technologies. Stephen Duncan was the richest slave owner in the antebellum South and had the most slaves during the time. However, life was different after he was born. Duncan was born on the 4th of March, 1787. He was the second of 5 children of Sarah and John Duncan. The family lived inside and grew up in Carousel and lived above the average means at the time. However, even though luck favored him at birth, it decided to take away a family member, most importantly his dad. At the age of 6, Stephen Duncan entered a duel. He was unfortunately killed. Duncan's mom remarried a man named Ephraim Blaine. Stephen Duncan continued standard classes at the time, and then went to Dixon College, located in Carousel, which his grandfather helped establish. So when we're looking at this, Stephen Duncan's family is extremely affluent with cash, and even though they did have hard times with their dad, they still grew and succeeded in life. He graduated in 1805, then re-enrolled in University of Pennsylvania for medicine. After that, he decided he was done with medicine and decided to go to Mississippi in 1808. This is because the U.S. had acquired new territory. During this time, he also had an uncle in Natchez County, Mississippi. There, he was shown by his uncle the life of a plantation owner. So we're starting to see Stephen go into plantation work and starting his career. People who lived in Natchez were usually wealthy slave owners. They called themselves Natchez Nabus. Nabus means someone who goes somewhere and comes back rich. Now, Mississippi is newly acquired at this time, and so many went down south, and they had great soil because of the Hamochito River. He wasn't considered an elite, however, in Natchez until he married Margaret Ellis on September 19th, 1811. Ellis had land originally connected to the Machito River, which is with the richest soil from the water in the river, kickstarted his new career as a plantation owner. Sadly, not many years after they married, Margaret Duncan died of yellow fever, and she died in 1815. So we're starting to see him gain more land and more wealth because of his previous marriage. And also, another thing we did not mention is they did have 2 kids together. 4 years later, he married Catherine Bigman. She was a member of the core family of the Natchez elite. They moved into urban plantation, and one generation Duncan created an economic empire with many pursuits. However, at the core lie slavery and agriculture. By the Civil War, Duncan had amassed 2,200 men and women and children, with a total of 15 slave plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi. Interestingly enough, though, he liked going back to forth from Pennsylvania and Mississippi for residency. During this time, his main crops were sugar and cotton. Therefore, it allowed him very liquid cash and allowed him to avoid economic disasters. At the time, he was worth $3.5 million United States USD, or $120 million in today's money. Now, Stephen Duncan was very affluent, and he married his next wife, Catherine Brigham, because of these reasons. Stephen Duncan, this propelled his career and his family's career. So he had 4 more children with Catherine Bigman, and in total he had 6 children. And they donated the Aberrant plantation to Mississippi after he died. One of the many decisions Stephen Duncan had to make was his identification as a National Republican and later a Whig. In 1832, he even represented Adams County at the 1832 Mississippi Constitutional Convention. He was fond of Jacksonian democracy. He was involved in the presidential campaigns for John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Because he had so much wealth, he was able to go into these political spheres as a new person in politics, but a major slave owner, and he had very much had weight in these political parties. And for example, if the Whigs prevailed, Duncan was in the running for Secretary of Treasury if they won the presidential contest. They didn't win the presidential contest, but if they did, he would gain a mass of political power over the entire country and its future. Duncan believed in high taxes, something that many slave owners in the South didn't favor. He argued that it protected the Southern economy by producing revenue. This revenue could be used to export excess slaves. So a common fear in the South was excess slaves because they excess slaves because excess slaves promoted white terror. White terror meaning that white people were afraid that slaves would revolt and rebel during this time. So this is 1832 during this time, 1840s, and many people were scared of slaves and they wanted to get rid of them but also keep them at the same time. They wanted to lower their power. This would affect crop saturation also. Crop saturation in the South was a big problem because the South produced so many crops, so many cash crops, that the price skyrocketed down actually. And so the U.S. had to have a way to get rid of some of these crops and some of these slaves. This would also reduce white fear of increasing slave population. Like I said, in 1831, he helped create the Mississippi Colonization Society. In the late 1840s, he resigned because of financial disagreements. He then went on to the American Colonization Society, the parent organization, and became the director for life in 1858. So because he had financial disagreements in Mississippi and some other political arguments, he resigned. And 18 years later, he decided to come back as director of the entire thing. That's crazy. Even with all his enrollment in the colonization, he seemed to never free any slaves. When the Civil War began, he blamed the North. Then he sided with the South. Soon after, Duncan blamed both sides. He constantly switched up and supported the opposition against both the North and the South. So this meaning that he supported the South originally, but because they started losing, he supported the North. And then eventually, after the Civil War, he decided, well, both are in the wrong.
Civil War. In the time leading up to the Civil War, he became part of the secessionist movement and believed that Mississippi should leave the Union. In the 1840s, Duncan continued to serve as a state senator and was later chosen to be part of the U.S. House of Representatives. After the abolition of slavery and the Civil War, his wealth was on a significant decline. With his plantations proving to be no longer profitable, Duncan continued to lose much of his land and property without the free labor to keep them afloat. In 1867, Stephen Duncan died and left only a very powerful, controversial figure in the American and South of Mississippi. Remembrance. I think that Eli Whitney should be remembered as a hard-working man who didn't care about the odds but kept going, kept having that strive to accomplish and be successful. I don't believe that Whitney knew that his invention would spark a wildfire of slavery across the United States, which would then lead to one of the bloodiest wars in the United States has ever seen. He didn't live to see the impact of his invention on the country, and he wasn't very interested in politics anyway, so he wouldn't have known the effect it had on slavery. Not only did he make an important invention, but he struggled for the rights to it. The redirection of his life was quite despairing. He should be remembered as a man who was trying to make a living for himself and make a difference. We should remember Stephen Duncan, on the other hand, because he serves as an important historical figure and a remembrance of historical events that had taken place, such as the Civil War, and how different people had different views on it, how he was trying to choose between being the South side or the North side, how who couldn't choose. Our remembrance of Stephen Duncan also will help us preserve the certain important factors for future generations to understand.